Hello and welcome to tonight's event, Set in Stone, What Should We Do with Controversial Monuments? Thank you all for joining us. My name is Asia Lara and I'm a program manager at Humanities Washington. We're a nonprofit organization whose mission is to open minds and bridge divides by creating spaces to explore different perspectives. We at Humanities Washington acknowledge that we present this program from the traditional and occupied lands of the Coast Salish peoples. We ask for those participating in this event, wherever they may be, to reflect on the lands they inhabit and acknowledge and pay respects to the ancestral and traditional territories of Indigenous peoples. As the fact that we are meeting virtually today instead of in person makes clear, this has truly been a strange, difficult, and extraordinary year. To help us make sense of it all, Humanities Washington presents a special series called What These Times Mean, Navigating 2020. This is our final event in the series, but you can see our past discussions on our YouTube page. We also have several upcoming Speakers Bureau events, so please check out our calendar at humanities.org to register for talks on such topics as Washington's undiscovered feminists and the ethics of climate change. This program was funded by the Why It Matters Civic and Electoral Participation Initiative, administered by the Federation of State Humanities Councils, and funded by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. We thank them for their support. If you're interested in programs like these, please consider donating through our website as well. Before we begin, I'd like to note that this event will be recorded and may include your name, audio, and/or video if you elect to participate. By continuing to attend, you consent to such a recording and its release, publication, exhibition, or reproduction. For tonight's event, our panelists will speak for around 45 minutes, followed by another 30 of Q&A. Please submit your questions using the Q&A box. We've got a lot of folks here tonight, so we unfortunately won't be able to answer everyone's questions, but we'll get to as many as possible. This is a time of high pressure, both politically and in everyone's personal lives. Our goal at Humanities Washington is to create a space where we can have these conversations in a civil manner. Just as we ask our panelists to handle disagreement with respect, we also ask you to do the same with your questions and comments. We are in different places with different circumstances and beliefs, but even so, tonight we are together and contemplating the same questions. With that in mind, I'd like to introduce our moderator. Mark James Carpenter is a PhD candidate at the University of Oregon, specializing in US history, Native American history, and the history of memory. Mark is an Oregon Humanities Center dissertation fellow and has received extensive recognition for his work on monuments and the settler history of the Pacific Northwest. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Mr. Carpenter.
Thank you so much, Asia, for that kind introduction. And before we dig into the question, I want to have our wonderful panelists introduce themselves, starting with Reiko.
Hi there. Thank you so much for having me and for inviting me alongside these incredible scholars. I really expect to learn from them. My name is Reiko Hillier, and I teach at Lewis and Clark College in Portland, where I'm an associate professor of history, and I also teach in the ethnic studies and gender studies programs. I teach a variety of courses in US history. I've written a book on memory in the American South, and I currently teach in the prison system as well.
Josh, go ahead.
My name is Josh Reed. I'm a member of the Snohomish Indian Nation here in the greater Puget Sound area. I am an associate professor in the History and American Indian Studies departments at the University of Washington, where I am the John C. Calhoun Memorial Endowed Chair of History. And I also direct the Center for the Study of the Pacific Northwest. So I'm very pleased to be here today.
Hi, everyone. I'm really honored to be here. My name is Jasmine Mahmood. I teach in the Arts Leadership Program at Seattle University. My teaching and research engages contemporary arts, including contemporary theater and performance, race, public policy, and geography.
Wonderful. And again, thank you all for being here. I too am very excited for this conversation. I want to start with a broad question. What impact do public monuments have on public memory and on the ways we conceive of the histories monuments memorialize and the histories that monuments erase? And then maybe Reiko, if you want to start off.
What impacts monuments have on public memory? So I want to frame my response to that with a famous quotation by George Orwell, at the risk of being hackneyed. Those who control the present control the past, and those who control the past control the future. That quote is so famous as to almost be a cliche. So I want to parse it a little bit and sort of use it as a way of containing a response that could be vast. Those who control the present control the past. In the case of Confederate monuments, which is what I've studied, what was the present in which these monuments were erected? They weren't erected right after the Civil War to memorialize the dead, but they were erected mostly starting in the 1890s to create in stone a mythic past that would legitimate their present, which was characterized by a violent counter-revolution against the radical experiment in interracial democracy that's known as Reconstruction. And this mythic past that's known as the lost cause was that slavery was a benevolent institution that played little part in causing the Civil War, that the Confederacy rightly and nobly fought only to defend states' rights against Northern invasion, and that during Reconstruction, Yankee aggressors who were bent on destroying Southern society imposed Negro domination upon a powerless region. Now, this interpretation, almost all historians would agree, is a fallacy, but by the 1890s, that mythology took hold of the nation, providing a kind of conceptual glue for segregation and disfranchisement and terrorism, and arguably persists to this day. So by celebrating the Confederate cause in public space, these monuments legitimized Jim Crow, which was just in its infancy. And these monuments then were a physical reminder of who was in charge. And to borrow from the historian David Blight, the Confederates essentially won with the pen and with marble and the lynch mob what they could not win on the battlefield, the cause of white supremacy and the dominant understanding of what the war was all about. So to make that point in a more general way, memorialization tells us a lot more about the period in which the memorialization occurred than about the events being memorialized. So we need to understand the context in which a monument was erected to appreciate its intent and its effect. The second part of that quote, those who control the past control the future. The lost cause version of the Civil War was a myth, but myths have material consequences. How we have remembered the Civil War has determined the very fate of democracy in the United States. Because if slavery is remembered as benevolent, then Americans of African descent can't be perceived as equal citizens. If slavery is seen as incidental rather than central to the Civil War, then the eradication of slavery in all of its forms would not be a commitment in the Civil War's aftermath. If Confederates are revered as noble patriots rather than traitors, well, then their power has to be quickly restored. If Reconstruction was an act of federal tyranny on a prostrate white South, then federal intervention couldn't be tolerated as a measure that's essential to protecting Black citizens from terrorism, disfranchisement, and economic subjugation. And so what became the dominant memory of the past helped to solidify the development and its persistence of racist apartheid in the United States. One need only consider what would happen to the future of the United States if we remembered the election of Joe Biden as stolen and illegitimate, if Black Lives Matter protesters are remembered as terrorists and so forth, what that would prophesy for the future of democracy. And what I'm suggesting is not paranoid. Recall that in Charlottesville in 2017, white nationalists who were galvanized and continue to be, gravitated specifically towards Confederate monuments and Confederate symbols as rallying points for their cause. And when in Charlottesville they chanted, "You will not replace us," this was a pledge to maintain their privilege and power, echoing the cries of white supremacists over a century ago. One final point, a slightly different point about the effect of monuments on memory, which is that while the erection of any monument expresses usually a clear ideological message, because they're placed in public spaces and set in stone, they come to be seen as natural and innocuous, which has the effect of normalizing views that have been and should continue to be contested. Memorials, by their nature, have a way of establishing a sense of permanence and a sense of universal values. But I think it's our job as a citizenry to interrogate whether or not that should be the case.
Thank you so much, Reiko, setting the terms of conversation there. That's wonderful. Wonder if either of other two panelists, Josh or Jasmine, want to kind of play off of anything that Reiko said or another way of looking at the same question?
Josh, you can go ahead.
Yeah. All right. Let's see. Yeah, I would like to definitely pick up on a point here that Reiko brought up. And that's this idea that myths have material consequences. And so the first image that I'd like to invoke here and engage with is that of this Chief Seattle statue. It's here in Seattle, in the southeast corner of Seattle Center. And I think in a lot of ways, this embodies this notion of myths having material consequences. It memorializes a sanitized anodyne version of the settler colonial history of this area, of this city. There's a plaque on it that reads, "Seattle, chief of the Suquamish, a firm friend of the whites, for whom the city of Seattle was named by its founders." Just like Reiko had mentioned, we should always pay attention to when these monuments were erected. This one was commissioned in 1907 and eventually unveiled in 1912 by Myrtle Lowry, a descendant of Seattle, on Founders Day. And statues like this of Native leaders who welcomed white settlement or were friends to whites, they give the impression that indigenous peoples gave their lands to the United States. And in return, we're pleased to receive the blessings of civilization. And, you know, these types of attitudes then obscure one of the original sins of this nation, the theft of native homelands and waters. And the plaque on this particular statue also erases the Duwamish Nation, the original owners of the land on which this very statue sits. You know, it doesn't note his identity as a Duwamish leader. It only notes his identity as a Suquamish, and he, you know, was connected to both nations at that time. And so there's no mention, of course, of Duwamish efforts to secure a reservation within or at the edge of the city limits. And so this statue was also erected during an era when it was nearly impossible for indigenous peoples to survive, much less thrive in the city. And most Americans in 1912 believed that real Indians, like Chief Seattle, were gone. And without proper contextualization, many Americans continue to believe in the myth of the vanished Indian. Which brings me back to where I picked up on that myths have material consequences. Because if indigenous peoples are all gone, then there's no need to honor treaty rights or native sovereignty or self-determination. So that's, Mark, how I would address that question and engage with some of the themes and topics that have already been invoked.
Thank you, Josh. Jasmine, do you want to chime in?
Sure, thanks so much. So one of the things I think about when I teach is what is public. Before COVID, and I've done a version kind of with remote learning since COVID, I asked my students to go to a public place for 10 minutes, observe what they see, and then come back and report kind of what made that place public. And Asia, I'm going to ask you to put slide 9 on, if that's okay. And so thinking about for you all, what is public? And I think we can complicate this question with scholars like Michael Warner or Catherine Squires that can think of, well, whose public is it? What are the counter publics? What are the alternative publics? Another way I think about public is through public policy. So I teach a class, Public Policy in the Arts, and we look at definitions of both public art and graffiti. Here is featured a statue of Robert E. Lee in Virginia that has graffiti over it by protesters. And the statue a few months after this was actually removed in Virginia. And it's interesting to me to think about the various meanings of this statue through what's public, but also through how public policy does succeed and fail to frame. So if you look at policy around public art, I'll read to you from Seattle's Municipal Code, Chapter 2032. The policy around public art says that public art has enabled people in all societies to better understand their communities and individual lives. And then in a different chapter, Seattle's Code on Graffiti, Chapter 10.7, it calls graffiti unauthorized markings that make a nuisance. And so thinking about what are the ways in which in this case, it could be argued that the graffiti here, the markings, the kind of unauthorized markings, allow the public to differently think about how this work is in their lives. So I think really thinking about what are the various ways in which we understand that concept of public and how that frames how we might think about these monuments, and also how folks are dialoguing with these monuments because of the harm that they do to many bodies.
Thank you, Jasmine. And I'll actually go ahead and chime in that one of the things that comes up a lot with conversations about monuments when I've done oral histories regarding them is how different they can impact different people. So a monument that may have a somewhat sanitized anodyne view to some Euro-American members of the community can be a reminder every day of active harm to people of color in the community who often see the truer thing behind the statue that shaped the moment of its creation. Josh, I wanted to kind of invite you to expand on what you mentioned briefly there with U Seattle, looking at what happens when we have conversations about controversial monuments that go beyond conversations just about Confederate monuments, both to monuments relating to the indigenous history of this land, and also, of course, to monuments to slaveholders beyond the Confederacy, both of which are very much in the public eye right now.
Yeah, I think I'll really kind of focus on the first part of that question. You know, here in the North American West, we have numerous monuments celebrating explorers and pioneers. You know, Mark, this is something you are very familiar with, of course. And we often frame the American West, you know, these monuments often frame the American West as an empty wilderness ready to be tamed by noble, brave whites. And so there are a whole host of Lewis and Clark monuments. I kind of went down a bit of a rabbit hole, you know, earlier, taking a look for, you know, different, you know, which of these monuments did I really want to discuss? And I was particularly struck by this one for a number of reasons. This is Stanley Wanlass's Arrival, and it sits at Fort Clatsop, and it was put up in 1982. And in this, we see that Lewis is towering over a Clatsop Indian and Clark. And once again, we get this narrative of the helpful Indian, this time showing Lewis and Clark, along with, you can see there in the lower left, I think it's Lewis's Newfoundland seaman, a flounder. You can't quite see the fish in this image. Well, actually, you can. I tried pointing to it on my screen and realized that helps no one. And then, of course, in the foreground, you've got Clark holding a quill. He's ostensibly sketching or taking notes about the fish. And this, you know, highlights the Corps' efforts at gathering knowledge of the West, as if they were the only ones, you know, gathering this knowledge, yet they are specifically engaging with indigenous knowledge being shown by this Clatsop Indian individual himself. Now, what we don't get from just a monument like this is how the Corps of Discovery was an important monument of US imperial expansion and aspirations. Again, this is a very kind of sanitized view of history in this sense. Asia, if you could move to the next slide. And then, of course, there's a whole plethora of pioneer mother monuments all throughout the American West. And this one is also a particularly interesting one. This one was erected in 1929. It is Avard Fairbanks' Pioneer Mother in Vancouver, Washington. And it's a little hard to make out in this, but she's got a rifle in her right hand. That's kind of that stick-like thing that you can see on the screen. And that's very useful for warding off dangerous Indians and animals. And so in these pioneer monuments, rifles or representations of apprehension or fear are often markers for violent conquest of the West. And in this particular monument, what we see is the firearm is in the hands of not just a woman, but a mother protecting children. So the artist has positioned her on the defensive, thereby making any violence that she engages in just. So what concerns me about these monuments is whether or not there is any material contextualizing or complicating the narratives that these monuments are telling. Arrival, the first one, is placed in a visitor center at Fort Clatsop. So it's at least got some information surrounding it. But what does the average visitor to this site learn about US Empire if they're just taking a quick look at Arrival? Like many Pioneer Mother statues and monuments across the West, Pioneer Mother is located outdoors in a small park and has no historical information contextualizing the pioneers themselves and conquest. So without this kind of information, statues like this naturalize the idea that white Americans were the primary historical actors, and oftentimes the only historical actors whose actions made the United States. They valorize manifest destiny and recast conquest as just or inevitable. So it's really kind of picking up on an earlier thread that has already been brought up about how these statues memorialize and naturalize values and assumptions that today we, should be able to problematize in richer ways.
Invite our other panelists, Rigo or Jasmine, kind of speak to, again, what should we or could we do looking at controversial monuments beyond the Confederate monuments?
I can go ahead, and Asia, if you can go ahead and pull up slide 10. Thank you so much. So coming up on this slide will be an image of a woman named Ona Judge. Ona Judge was born in the late 1700s. She was enslaved, and she lived in Philadelphia. And because she lived in Philadelphia, the law at the time was that if an enslaved person lived in a free state, they would become free after 6 months. And so the people that owned her, every 5 months and 25 days, they marched her south of the Mason-Dixon line to make sure that she continued to be enslaved. And so this is I encourage you all to read the book by Erica Armstrong Dunbar, the book for young adults. And if Asia, you go to the next slide, the slave owner of Ona Judge was George Washington. And this is the Deface George Washington monument at University of Washington's campus. And so it's interesting to think about how, when we think about Ona Judge's story, right, like always days close to freedom and then marched down and then enslaved again, how that might further animate the story, the story of George Washington. And I really appreciate, Josh, how you're thinking about, how you're framing for us, thinking about the contextualizations that do and do not exist, and how when we know histories of the people that surround sometimes the people that are so valorized in our history, what different narrative might that add to the monument? So I wanted to just kind of show that story, to think about even the people that we most esteem in our country, kind of things that they've done that have been pernicious in our society.
Reka, did you have any thoughts you wanted to add? I know you also had some thoughts on the next question.
Yeah, very quickly. I think that what both of my co-panelists have reminded us too is that once you begin, I don't necessarily have specific categories of monuments that I want to incorporate, but I do think that the point here is that once you begin to consider monuments as an historical document that reflects certain kinds of ideological purposes and reflects maybe a particular constituency that had an interest in promoting a particular narrative, and that the moment of its erection is maybe more to the point than whatever history it's purportedly documenting. I think these are just tools for us all to take with us to start to question and think about all of the monuments that we walk by unthinkingly on a daily basis. One thing to think about, for example, is the monuments that might appear to be sort of compensatory. So I'm thinking about the Lincoln Monument that's in Richmond, Virginia, which was so controversial to people who sympathized with the Confederacy. This is a monument that was erected in the last century. I mean, like within the past 20 years. But it's Lincoln sitting down with his son. And it's this very paternal, non-threatening, sort of pastoral view of a father and his boy. And the inscription is, you know, to bind up the nation's wounds, this thing. Rarely is the rest of his second inaugural quoted, which is a few lines down after to bind up the nation's wounds. You know, we hope that the scourge of this war will pass away. Yet, if God wills that it continue until all the wealth piled up by the bondsman's lashes will be repaid by blood drawn from the sword. I mean, this sense of justice, this sense of righteousness, that emancipation and the destruction of slavery is part of divine will. I mean, we can debate, you know, about his evolution or his racism or what have you, but my point here is just to think about what it means to have the only monument to the Union in the South, the Union victory. There's no monument to memorialize the emancipation of 4 million people, but there is a cozy monument of Lincoln sitting down with his son, you know, who's like 8 years old in the thing. So it's just to say that I think that we should just be asking these same questions of all the things we tend to walk by, and use these kinds of tools to interrogate what we see.
Wonderful. Thank you. And that's actually a great segue to the last of the formal questions, looking at how should we define or redefine what public monuments are or should be, and how do we create new historical symbols to reshape collective memory. And Jasmine, if you want to start us off with this one.
Thank you so much, Mark. And Asia, if you can pull up the 12th slide. So I asked you all, or I gave you all the example of an exercise I do where I ask my students, what is public, or what's a public space? And they often come back, oh, a public space is accessible or it's free, and all of those are great. And we talk about public policy. And one of the definitions I give my students that I define a public space as any space where other people are putting meanings on my body. A space where anyone is maybe gendering me, thinking about my age, my race, my occupation. And so I think that's interesting to think about when we think about public. How do these monuments put meanings on our bodies? This is a monument that was in New York of Dr. James Marion Sims, kind of the father of gynecology, who pioneered his field by testing on Black women without anesthesia. And thinking about how for many people, especially for many Black women, seeing this statue put meanings of pain on their body. Even today, the legacy of that Black women, the ones that are the most educated, die 3 times in childbirth over white women in the United States. And thinking about kind of how his work with putting pain on Black women kind of seeps into our bodies today. And so these women staged a protest in 2017, wearing these gowns with blood to kind of give this meaning, to amplify, and to think about the meanings that are put on their bodies, but also to put their meanings into space. And so I give us kind of, to answer Mark's question, or to think about Mark's question, to think about how forms like performance might animate meanings of monuments in ways that are actually more true to the complexity of history and presence. In my field, I define performance through a lot of scholars as embodied actions framed in time and space. And we can think about artistic performances, cultural performances, and everyday performances, and how those things often bump up against each other. How you might see this as an artistic performance that makes you think about the everyday. And the last thing I'll name is there's a really great New York Times op-ed that was authored this June 2020 by Carolyn Randall Williams, who's a poet, and it was titled, "You Want a Confederate Monument? My Body is a Confederate Monument." And she wrote this from her place, the Black woman, and it really registered with me. I'm descendant of slaves. My father, who's Black, has blue eyes, and many Black people in the United States know that their legacy is in dialogue with rape of enslaved Black women to propagate new enslaved people. And so thinking about monuments, not just as these kind of steady kind of archives, but also living in people and how those things are in dialogue with each other. Whereas me as a Black woman, if I walk by this statue of a man who inflicted pain on Black women, what that might do to my body and how I might use my body to make other people aware of that. And so thinking about performance as a way to kind of intervene or to add complexity to meanings made by these monuments, I think is one way to think about your question, Mark.
So much. I want to invite the other panelists, Rico or Josh, kind of speak to either side of this question, both defining, redefining, and how we might look at creating new symbols to reshape.
I can go. I don't have much to add to that incredible point. I mean, I love this idea of incorporating the body and performance not only into our understanding of the monument in real time, but as a new way of thinking about monuments altogether. That these are things that purport to be permanent and kind of unquestioned, and yet that kind of dynamic dialogue or provocation clearly requires us to think otherwise. A little less powerful than live bodies. If Asia, you could turn to image 8. I'm showing a monument from I was about to say, Kelly Ingram Park, sorry, in Birmingham, Alabama, where children during the Children's Crusade, as it was known in the early 60s in Alabama, were set upon with fire hoses and dogs. And one of the things that I really appreciate about this monument is that often in the public memory of the freedom struggle, there's this question of violent versus nonviolent protest, which is a dichotomy that completely omits the fact that most violence that was perpetrated was by white supremacists and not by protesters. So too today, vis-a-vis the police. But one of the things I like about this monument then is that it highlights the violence of segregation, of racist apartheid. It highlights the experience of the person who is walking down this path, right? Rather than looking up to presumably stand in humble awe of a venerated figure, you're forced to walk through this gauntlet of rabid, vicious dogs. However, even though this does seem to acknowledge at least the violence that was required to underwrite and uphold Jim Crow, there are no humans holding these dogs, right? So on the one hand, yes, dogs have often been seen as the kind of metaphor for the brutality of the institutions that have oppressed people of African descent, whether they be the patrol dogs of slave patrols in the antebellum South, or police dogs, but with no humans to hold to account. It actually could have a different kind of effect or implication. So I guess I'm just positing here that in addition to bodies and performance, I think creating monuments that actually challenge us to think about the crisis of the moment and the vulnerability and courage of those who are, fighting for democracy. That kind of effort to glorify doesn't sanitize the truth of conflict and bloodshed.
Thank you. Josh?
You can get rid of the.
Yeah. All right. So I think it's worth noting that, of course, lots of different peoples and societies and communities, erect monuments for a whole variety of different reasons and purposes. And from my perspective, what I'd like to take a look at are some that have been put up by Indigenous peoples themselves. And what I find is that these monuments push back against the narratives of erasure. And so what we have here on this slide are welcome figures at the entrance to Nia Bay Village out at Cape Flattery on the grounds of the Makah Cultural and Research Center. Now, historically, welcome figures faced the water to honor guests as they arrived at Northwest Coast villages. These figures, however, are placed right along the road entering Nia Bay in recognition for how most visitors to the reservation today arrive. Yet they continue to reflect Makah values of honoring guests, signaling that visitors are entering sovereign Makah territory. We can move on to the next slide, Asia. So, it's worth noting that, that monuments can serve a whole variety of different purposes. Again, back to that point of it depends on the context of them being installed. And some of these are done in collaboration with local municipalities. Take Susan Point's Interaction, a piece put up here in Friday Harbor in 2004. It's a stylized Coast Salish portal of welcome, filled with carved images of Coast Salish values highlighting relationships between Indigenous peoples and other than human relatives, such as orcas and salmon. And what's really important about this particular piece is that it's the first public acknowledgement of the island's Indigenous peoples. San Juan Island was heavily used by Lummis, Samish, Swinomish, and other tribal nations historically. And Native peoples who identify as Mitchell Bay Indians, that's kind of up around that Garrison Bay English camp area, these people lack federal recognition and they continue to reside on San Juan Island, but their presence is largely erased. Susan Point, the artist who created this, is a member of the Coast Salish Musqueam Nation in British Columbia. And when Point began working on this piece, she purposefully reached out to Mitchell Bay Indians to gain their permission at placing this monument in Friday Harbor and to discuss her design. And so these are important steps, this consultation piece, and then putting up a monument like this at correcting the erasure of San Juan Island's Native history and contemporary Indigenous peoples. I like to point out that there are, recent monuments that are setting out trying to, correct some of these narratives, trying to provide a counterpoint. And these types of projects particularly excite me.
Josh, I think we're going to transition into Q&A in just a second, but I think I might prime the pump with a question of my own because I know it's central to a lot of my work, which is where might the lines fall, and they're always blurry, between a monument that might need to be recontextualized and a monument that because of the harm it does might need to be removed. Because I know often in my work, that's kind of the key inflection point that comes up. And certainly, I'll say for my part, one of the first places I look is what impact does it have on the people who were harmed by this figure or what this figure represents. That to me seems like an overwhelming discussion, but it does get fuzzier with certain national figures like, say, George Washington, where there might be multiple investments in it from multiple sides. So very free-ranging question. I invite the panelists to speak as they'd wish.
I guess I can go ahead. I think one thing to think about is kind of accepting the kind of imperfection and the complexity, but thinking about the process of kind of doing that recontextualization. I'm a Washington State Arts Commissioner, and kind of some of the work that the Washington State Arts Commission does is it picks curators, it has juries that pick the public art that gets displayed on state universities and schools and other state buildings. And all of that has been a juried process, starting with laws in the 1970s. And so thinking about those processes as well, and what are the questions that those juries ask? What do they ask about artistic merit? What do they ask about history? What do they ask about contextualization? And what do they ask of their communities? And so I think a lot of the questions that we have, the kind of complexity and unsettling, we might think about, well, how might that become part of a process that a public governing body might use when thinking about how to recontextualize art?
All right, and now, yes, Josh.
Yeah, I sometimes, think about the placement of that monument, where it is, its positionality within a particular space, and in a community, and what it has to say to the people who say pass by it on a daily basis or often in some way. So, Mark, in a lot of ways, I too kind of think about it in the terms of who are the people whom this monument harms in that sense.
Wonderful. Yeah, and of course, a public monuments, but the public is in the name in a way that other art isn't. I think sometimes the conversation about monuments can get caught up in a broader conversation about problematic art, but monuments are fundamentally different when you can't avoid them in a way where you could avoid something in a space where it's contextualized in a museum or something similar. Aisha, I wonder if we've got some questions.
Yes, we do. So for everybody, do you foresee that pioneer settler statues in Washington State and the greater Pacific Northwest will be removed or torn down?
I guess I should probably speak up about this since I introduced this one as one of our threads to examine. I really don't know. And I think it comes back to that point of where these monuments are, kind of the spatial aspects of them. And it also can get into ideas of, are there opportunities to contextualize? Or is the monument itself, kind of so problematic that it needs to be removed and placed somewhere else where it can be perhaps contextualized, or it just needs to be, out of sight. And so, for example, there was the one in San Francisco. Mark, do you remember the name of that one? A couple of years ago, it was taken down. It was part of a big roundabout.
It was early days.
Yeah, there we go.
Happersburger.
And it was, really kind of, showing, genocide against Native peoples. It was embodying, well, you can save yourselves by missionizing, by embracing Christian values and things like that. And that was one that through public conversation was unanimously within the board that was responsible for making a decision about that, was then chose to remove it. So I think I don't think we should make a blanket let's remove them all, but I think what we should do is they need to be re-examined and discussed as to what we should do with that particular with these particular monuments.
Other thoughts now that I've changed my microphone? My apologies to the audience. I'll leap in. I was part of the research on one of those monuments that was so problematic. So I'll say, if nothing else, I predict and hope that there will be a massive re-examination of all of the pioneer monuments to make those sorts of determinations and to figure out both impact and intent. Because I do think there is some level, something that you brought up, Reiko, that it does matter a little bit. What is the pose of the monument? What is the intent behind the monument? What are the words on the monument, right? That can shape the extent to which it might be recontextualized and the extent to which it's just irreducibly a symbol of violent white supremacy, as some of these monuments assuredly are.
Mark, one thing I wanted to add, you were saying earlier, kind of comparing what we imagine to be public art with what we might imagine to be art within a museum space. And I think one difference, and it's not always the case, there are kind of curators that are commissioned by state and federal agencies, but thinking about how museums often have curators, and the root of the word curator comes from to care. And thinking about, so one of the questions we might ask ourselves in this framing is thinking about who is caring for this work, and how does that care, or perhaps what we might perceive of a lack of care, dialogue with how these controversies take place, because there isn't a public steward that is kind of giving this context or explaining why changes have been made.
Thank you. I think we might be ready for the next question, but of course, speakers, feel free to circle back around as we go.
Yeah, definitely. Let's see. Question for all panelists, drawing on the performance example that Jasmine brought up. While many statues may be removed and or have context given via performance or text, many institutions with names of controversial figures, local example, Woodrow Wilson High in Tacoma, are being examined and possibly changed. Do you find that these instances are a good way to engage community discussions? What else might be gained during that process?
That's a great question. And I think it also calls into mind who hasn't been captured or archived by history. In my field, I think a lot about, and a lot of scholars, including Diana Taylor, talk about what's called the archive and the repertoire. So the archive being these things like monuments that can be stored, like books, and often in academia and public realms, that archive is given kind of the central weight of history. But actually there's forms of knowledge like the repertoire, like embodiment, that circle archives, or that we need to access archives as super important. And why that's interesting is that for many marginalized people, their knowledge has been most stored in repertoires. And so I know from people of African descent that are in the US, much of our knowledge is through repertoires. And so what does that mean for buildings that are named largely after white men? How we might think about ways to do that differently, or ways to think about kind of what % of high schools are named after who. So just kind of to add that to the conversation.
And I would like to pick up on an idea that kind of comes to me with that particular question. And that's that, the process of re-examining these monuments and grappling with their meanings to us today, and whether they, belong up, or whether, Woodrow High should, keep that name. What excites me about that is that it opens up a historical discussion where we are inviting the public to actually do history. Taking down a monument or erasing a name on a building or changing a name on a building isn't erasing history. What it is it's actually doing history, because it's our job as historians to interpret the past and to help make it relevant today and into the future. And so, that's an ongoing process. History is not just kind of a, dump of facts, and that's, what it is. That's what most people oftentimes kind of think of. So, they conflate, memorialization and history. And what we're really talking about are two different things. So for me, I really see these discussions as opportunities to engage historically with these figures, with these values, and they should be, revisited as our times change. It's like, if I go in for brain surgery, I'm not going to want to be working with 1950s technology. No, I want the modern stuff. And that's the same thing for, historians. We should be applying, our tools today in the work we do at interpreting the past.
And I think I'll chime in and say that historically, our nation, like most nations, has changed monuments and names before, and we'll do it again, right? This is a specific process and a way to this specific moment, and a very wonderful moment for doing that. But one of the first things that happened after the American Revolution was changing a bunch of names and taking down some monuments to the monarch. And that's continued in multiple iterations ever since. So it's worth looking at. This is not the idea that we should change the names and monuments to better reflect what our values are is not a new idea. It's just an idea that remains frustrated in many circles.
I guess I would just add that as symbolically powerful and, to my mind, right it is to tear down a monument, there is a kind of way in which that can be perceived as a violent act that is the end of the conversation. And I think that what is exciting about what Josh said is that simply interrogating why we lift up certain figures over others is part of an exercise of civic engagement and critical thought. Because we're not just talking about a marketplace of ideas in which some groups are now silencing other groups. We're talking about monuments and memorialization, which by definition are usually about veneration and glorification, right? One of the reasons why the Vietnam War Memorial by Maya Lin was so controversial was precisely because it raised questions about the wisdom of that war. And that's an uncomfortable thought for a lot of people. And maybe that's one of the questions, going back to the earlier question about rethinking monuments. Are we willing to have monuments that do more than venerate, right? Is the response simply to lift up a different narrative? Or do we want monuments that are asking us to constantly engage in critical inquiry rather than simply go through waves of pushing forward and counter reaction? Maybe the job of the monument is precisely to force us into constant re-examination.
Asia, I think we're ready.
Awesome. Let's see. In light of recent events and in your own personal opinions, is it always, never, or sometimes okay to deface a monument in protest?
I guess I can answer that. For me, I'm going to sidestep this question. And for me, what's interesting is the meanings made by that. So I do a lot of formal kind of like art historian analysis in my class where students will analyze a work of art, and we'll look at a work of art and I'll ask questions, what are the colors? What are the lines? What are the shapes? What are the textures? What is the harmony or disharmony? And you could do a really thoughtful kind of art analysis of a monument, kind of an image of it, or your embodied engagement of it before or after it was defaced, and think about, or before and after it had, paint put on it, and think about what meanings is this making? And then kind of thinking, going from that formal analysis to a contextual analysis, well, how are those meanings in dialogue with the moment? Wouldn't thinking about this moment, this summer of a lot of uprisings that are kind of responding to centuries of racial injustice, racial inequities. What does it mean for a monument not to have graffiti paint on it? What meanings does that make? What does it mean for a monument to have graffiti paint on it? What meanings does it make? So thinking about kind of what are the kind of formal and contextual meanings made by the monument, and how that dialogues with the meanings that the nation and people of the nation are making at the time, are questions that I would add to kind of animate that as well.
I think you've summed up the issue beautifully. I suspect that at the end of the day, we're all going to end up in somewhere of sometimes, although the relative sometimes might be different for different people. I think there's certainly, there can be cases. I'm thinking, so I'm coming from Oregon. There was a recent protest that in process of it involved doing harm to a quilt that had been made by Black women for a sesquicentennial. So there can be places where it goes too far, but I often worry about that question being turned to kind of creating some sort of clinical absolute determination of right and wrong, rather than doing what I think Jasmine suggests brilliantly, which is looking at why, how, and what does this do?
Agreed. Next question we have is, should we continue to make monuments of people Or will people always be a mix of good and bad actions that we don't want to approve of altogether? Is it better to only make monuments of ideas so we don't accidentally glorify a person who society does not completely approve of?
Well, I think one of the points that we've come to, and talked about all of us at different points with, the monuments we were engaging with or the images, is that, these monuments capture ideas. I mean, the Confederate monuments are about white supremacy, and so we are today asking ourselves, is that the value that we want to prioritize? Is that what we want to valorize in our public spaces? The answer should be an easy answer of a resounding no. Yet obviously some people, aren't, just aren't thinking of monuments that way. Again, back to the idea of confusing monuments with history. So for me, I actually think we should continue producing monuments of ideas, of people, of events, of moments, and we should continue reevaluating those, and thinking, 10, 20, 50, 100 years down the road, are those values reflective of who we are in our society at that time? So, I don't think the answer is this, kind of the safe one where we're just like, yeah, no monuments to anything, because down the road it might get us in trouble. Instead, let's be open to, reinterpreting and revaluing our choices on what we are going to memorialize. So that's how I feel about these types of these monuments.
I guess I could just add thinking about the complexity. So thinking about the father of gynecology, and I was really inspired by the work of those women kind of staging this performance, and agree with their decision. I agree with the decision to take it down. And also, I think about my own health and how my health has benefited from that doctor, and thinking about the complexity and how that lands on my body, and how I am able to think about the complexity because of the events over the last 3 years, both with the statue, with the monument, and with the protest and performances against the horrors of that doctor. So I think also honoring and making space for the complexity, I think, is needed. And thinking about what are the ways in which, as kind of our panelists have so thoughtfully framed today, what is the ways in which we might think about stewarding monuments to do so, to have us think about that complexity, both historically and as it lands on bodies today.
And I'm excited that monuments provoke, public discussion and thinking of, more critically about our past. And so, I see these monuments in dialogue with our society. I think it's a mistake to just think, again, because they're set in stone, that that's the end all be all of that moment, of that person, of that idea, whatever it is that the monument is reflecting. So, I think we should be engaging with monuments in a variety of different ways.
And I think I think you can. There's a certain act of humility in recognizing that we, with whatever we are using, are not necessarily at the moral pinnacle of humanity at this. So even if it's a monument to ideas, it might be that some of the ideas we now wish to memorialize in 50 or 100 years no longer seem the same. And those people 50 to 100 years from now may be correct. So I think it's okay. I think anytime you put up a monument, it's worthwhile to think that it may be set in stone, but that doesn't make it permanent for time immemorial. It can and should be re-examined by successive generations.
Wonderful. Let's see, we have a question regarding from a teacher who says, when teaching mid-high schoolers about the founding fathers, curriculum tends to be glorified. How would you like younger generations to read or understand this history and the monuments that they come across?
I used to teach middle school and high school, and so I really appreciate this question. And I guess just to, at the risk of being repetitive, I would reiterate like what an incredibly potent teaching moment to just do the practice of critical thinking and following someone's curiosity and help them develop their sense of values about which kinds of people they consider to be their heroes, and should we and shouldn't we. I think this question of the complexity of any of these folks who are memorialized it needs to be understood and explored, and the messiness of history. I think those of us who are trying to engage in a challenge to the traditional narrative that sort of is an apologia for genocide and white supremacy, I think that we are often sort of portrayed in absolute terms, almost like, sort of like, I don't know, thought police, political correctness, this kind of thing, as though we're trying to shut down debate and dialogue, when precisely I hope that the point is that the opposite is true, that these controversies and these monuments or school names are touchstones, are possibilities for dialogue. Oh, this thing that I took for granted seems to hurt you. What does it mean to you? Well, but he wasn't all bad. He did this good and he did that. Well, so how do we measure these people? No one is all good or all bad. Are any of you who are 8 years old all good or all bad? Do you do bad stuff sometimes? I mean, it's like any age group can have this conversation about the complexity of whom we may choose to valorize, and who deserves that, and for whom, and who gets to decide. So I don't know. I tend to think that rather than what some folks see it as, like one is a negative view of American history and one is a positive view of American history, I think we're all just richer humans if we can develop a critical thinking skills that allows us to embrace the messiness of humanity. Like all these people that are up there on the pedestal, they're all just people, no more, no less, all of them, right? And that's a way to sort of have some compassion for people's flaws, but it doesn't mean that we have to have them dominate public space. If that erection, so to speak, was not decided by a democratic process, and if it does not reflect an expansive view of inclusion and democracy.
That's a really, really moving response, Rico. And I want to add just that I really appreciate that question coming in. When I get students at the college level, two things that they're often surprised about learning in my classes. The first is the beginning of, in the United States, federally funded art under FDR. So what often people know as the Works Progress Administration, WPA artist, and actually, under FDR, differently, the Treasury Relief Program, which built new post offices and said 1% of the cost of post offices should go to public art. So learning about that for students is really interesting. And why I'm kind of linking it is that also under FDR, redlining began. The process that said if you're Black, you get the worst loan or you're denied a home loan. And so thinking about kind of that complexity that arguably FDR is incredibly valorized president. He's one of my favorite presidents if I were to rank them. And he started kind of one of the major funding sources under his administration for public art as we know it today. And also under his administration, we have cities racially segregated as we know them today. And to me, that complexity is so interesting, especially as it lands on how we understand monuments. And so just to kind of echo Reiko, like thinking about the complexity of our leaders, I think adds more depth to how and what students are learning.
I just want to add one more point based on this issue of where the whole notion of public art began, and how it rests on a certain kind of notion of the public as, taxpayers being responsible to and also benefiting from a public sphere. I think that's another conversation to initiate with the 7-year-old or earnest adults in any community, is like, who gets to decide? And who's paying for it? almost every single statue in Charlottesville was funded by one person. A 5-year-old can understand that that's not exactly fair. I don't care who's on those statues. Is that really fair? So I think it has to do too with the process of what gets this scarce and honored place of being in public space, and who gets to decide that.
Yeah, I also really appreciate that question. I too taught middle school before going back for my doctorate. And, I'm always looking for those teachable moments. And, middle schoolers, high schools, I mean, really, students of any age really like those teachable moments. It's a great opportunity to show that the textbook history is one tiny slice of one perspective, and you can kind of talk about some of the issues with how that historical narrative becomes the definitive one that appears in the textbook, and then get into the richness of the complexity of the past. I mean, monuments are great tools for thinking about all those historical critical thinking skills of contingency, complexity, change over time. I mean, you hit every single one of those by inviting your students to think about the monuments in the public spaces that they live in and walk and travel through. And I think that just really enriches their understanding of what history actually is. It's about interpreting the past. It's not just about a bunch of sterile facts that somebody else has decided for you, i.e. a textbook adoption committee in a big state that isn't at Washington state that is making those decisions, driving those narratives.
Thank you, Josh, and thank you all panelists. We're close to the end. I want to make sure there's some time here at the end. We can both share final thoughts and share with the audiences places where they could go to learn more about your work. And I'll selfishly take the first step of that. I do some work on pioneer monuments in the Northwest, and I've got an article in the summer 2020 Oregon Historical Quarterly to that effect, and another on the Center for the Study of Women in Society annual review for 2020. Both of those should be readily available to Washingtonians, and the second one is free for everybody. So feel free to look there if you want to learn more about my work. Reiko?
Hi there. I would love to promote my book, which is now 6 years old, but might as well because I don't have another one just yet, called Designing Dixie. Tourism, Memory, and Urban Space in the New South. And it's actually not particularly about Confederate monuments, but it is about Southern cities that decided to actually avoid any association with the Confederacy in order to attract tourism and investment from the North. So it looks at Atlanta, which aimed to be the Chicago of the South, and St. Augustine, Florida, which aimed to be a Spanish colonial Renaissance town in the heart of the American Mediterranean, and so forth. So I look at sort of the culture and political uses of particular kinds of landscape design and tourist identity. And I currently I'm working on a book manuscript on mass incarceration, and I have some journal articles that are probably not accessible to folks who don't have university affiliation. But I will plug a magazine called All Rise, which is a prisoner publication for which I wrote the introduction. And it is a beautiful piece of work, really high quality graphics. And it's available for print, and they could use your help. All Rise.
Thank you. Josh?
Yeah, this has been great. And I think one of the things, one of my big takeaways in, both kind of preparing for this and in reflecting back on our discussion is, that what we're doing here is history. And what the audience is doing and thinking critically about these monuments is also doing history. And so I'm always advocating opportunities when, we can, do that kind of work. So about myself, My book is 5 years old, and it's The Sea is My Country. It's about the macaws and their relationship with their marine environment. My research largely focuses on indigenous marine space, histories of that. And the current work deals with indigenous explorers in the Pacific. And so a lot of what motivates kind of my historical work is to really try to correct that erasure of Native history, of indigenous histories. So, I'm sure that you probably picked up on that based on some of my comments today. But thank you all for giving me the opportunity to be a part of this.
Thank you, Josh. Jasmine, you got the last word?
Great, thank you so much. I'll just name, I've been writing a monthly column for the South Seattle Emerald, which is published by Marcus Green, who's a Black journalist and publisher. And in my column, I've been writing specifically about Black, Indigenous, and of color artists. And so I'll just name two of the artists because so much of my work is about archiving artists that are often not centered in these conversations. And so two artists I want to name that might be interesting for you all to look up. Both were and are based in Washington State. The first, James Washington Jr., was born in Mississippi, moved to the Pacific Northwest in 1944, a Black artist, and he became an artist who sculpted out of stone. And so some of his work is at the Sheraton Hotel and Seattle Art Museum. And there's also a James and Janie Washington Foundation in the Central District that has many of his public sculptures. And I think if you're able to walk by them, think about the meanings that he makes. And then second is an artist who's living, her name is Matika Wilbur. She is Indigenous Swinomish and Tulalip. She is working on a project called Project 552, where she interviewed Native Americans from all 552 recognized federal tribes, as well as those not in those tribes, and documented them. And in my October column, I wrote about a mural that she did in Pioneer Square. And so it's just thinking about kind of what are the artists and stories that are not centered by this, and how might we center them to think more critically about history.
Thank you all so much. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, but please submit any lingering questions to our speakers@humanities.org mailbox. We'd be happy to pass them along. From all of us at Humanities Washington, we thank you for joining us. And of course, thank you to Mark, Reiko, Jasmine, and Josh for such an incredible discussion. Good night, everyone.